Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be looking at constructor overloading in Java. So in the last video, we learned about method overloading. It's basically the idea where you represent the same method in multiple forms with the same name. Basically when different kinds of shapes are still shapes. And long before that, we also learned about constructors. It's basically a kind of a method that allows you to set your instance variables when you create your object. Let me just show you an example. Right, so I made this class called constructing, which contains the main method where I'll be calling all my functions and everything. And I also made this other class called superhero, which is the class I'm going to be looking at today. We learned before that a constructor is something that I can use to set my instance variables. Now I could also use setter methods. These are methods which are specifically designed to call a method and to set the value of the instance variable using that method. However, a constructor is much easier to use because it's automatically called whenever I make my object. So in this case, let's just make a few setter methods. So we'll make one, the name of the superhero, the power, and the age. Right. If I use a setter method to set the values of these instance variables, it would look something like this. Public void set name string name, and we just set our name to names. Now I would have to make the same method for many of these different instance variables. It's definitely a little harder. Instead, I could replace my setter method with a constructor that looks a little like this. Right. So if you look at my constructor, you should remember that my constructor will have the same name as the class it is in. It has three local variables or parameters, n, p, and a. N is for name, p is for power, and a is for the age. And I'm just setting all my values to whatever the user enters when he creates the object. But before we make the object, let's add a few getter methods to display the values. So this is to return the name, this is to return the power, and this is to return the age. And let's just make our object. Superhero j is new superhero. So when I make this new superhero, my constructor is called and I need to add the values. My name, so let's just say Surya, my power, let's just say smart, and my age is 15. Right, so you can see how constructors are much better at setting my values than a typical setter method. But this is just a quick review. If you still find constructors confusing, check out my previous video. Now let's actually finally understand what constructor overloading is. Right, so constructor overloading is the same as method overloading. It's basically the same thing. In method overloading, you would take a particular method and you would make another method with the same name, but you change one of three parameters. So one could be the order in which you write your parameters, one could be the data types of your parameters, and another one could be the number of parameters. Now a good example is this program. So here I have multiple area methods. These are multiple methods intended to calculate the area of multiple different shapes. So this is for a circle, this area method is for a triangle, and this area method is for a rectangle. All of them have the same name, but I'm exploiting these three factors, right? So this method and this method have a different number of parameters. So even if they have the same name, I can overload them by changing or by using the difference in the number of parameters. That's one way. Another way is changing the order of parameters. If you look at these two methods, well, they have the same number of parameters. So what I did is I changed the order of parameters. So this is a double and an integer, and then this is an integer and a double. Now since the order of the parameters is different, the compiler can still differentiate these two methods, so I can overload these two methods. Constructor overloading is the same thing. I'm basically creating multiple constructors. All of them have the same name, but they either have a different number of parameters or they could have a different order of parameters. So if you look at this constructor, there's currently no reason for me to overload it. I mean, I have three variables, I'm setting three variables. There's no incentive for me to overload this constructor. But let's assume in reality, not all superheroes want to reveal their name. So let's say I'm a superhero who is currently in this database or website or something, and I'm setting my values. And I decide, well, I just don't want to enter my name, so I leave this empty. And it's going to cause an issue because my compiler is going to search for a certain constructor without this variable. And you can see that obviously causes an error because I only have one constructor which requires three parameters, not two. So obviously the better solution is to overload this constructor to make another constructor with just two parameters. So let's just copy this over here and let's just remove one of these parameters. In this case, the name parameter, because as I told you, some superheroes, they just don't mention their name. Realistically, this constructor requires only two parameters. Now, this causes another error. I'm saying name equals n, but there is no n over here. So let's just set this to the default value for that variable, null, which is just null. And this is another tip. Whenever you make a constructor and you have extra instance variables, just set it to default values. So if it's an integer, you would set it to 0. If it's a float or a double, you would set it to 0.0. And if it's a boolean, you would just set it to false. Now you see that my error disappears. When I make another constructor that takes in two parameters and I call two parameters, the compiler is going to go into the superhero class. It's going to search for this constructor which takes in two values. It's going to find that constructor that takes in two values. And it's going to call this constructor that takes in two values. So it works well now. And I really can add how many ever constructors I want. In this case, these two constructors, even though they have the same name, superhero, they're still different because this one takes in two parameters and this one three, right? The number of parameters is different. Another way is just changing the order of parameters. And to highlight this point, I'll just copy this constructor over here. And you can see there's an issue. I mean, I have two constructors, both of them have the same name, and it's harder for the compiler to differentiate into the constructors. So what I'll do here is change this order. Make this an int a and then string p. And you can see that the error or whatever disappears, right? Because calling a superhero constructor where your first parameter is a string and your second value is an integer is different from calling a superhero constructor where your first value is an integer and your second value is a string. This is again another way of overloading constructors. So I just remove this since it's not really required for my program. Now if you watched my constructors video or if you know about constructors, you should also know that Java makes a default constructor. So if I just remove the constructors I made, it's going to cause an error because I'm entering parameters here. And if I just remove this, I know it doesn't look like it. It just looks like I have a superhero class which has three instance variables, has three getter methods. But in reality, there is another constructor here. I mean, it's not visible. You can't see it. But Java made one for you. That's why when you call superhero, it's actually calling that other constructor. That other constructor, often known as the default constructor. And I'll just show you how it looks, right? So it's just the same thing, public superhero, and we're just going to enter the default values. Name is null, power is null, and age is 0. And I didn't even have to make this. You can see that even if I remove this, I don't have any error. The compiler is calling that default constructor, which is there. It's not visible, but it's there. It's calling the default constructor and it's setting these default values. To prove that to you, let's call one of these getter methods and let's see what values are returned. right? So let's just print obj.get power, and let's see what's printed, and we get null. You can notice I didn't make a constructor that can set power to a null value, but Java made one for me. That's why when I print power, I get null. And the reason this is important is because whenever you make your own constructor, you are replacing the default constructor that Java made for you. So you don't have your default values again. So let's just add our original constructors again. Now I have my original constructors, but these constructors replace the default constructor. If I remove my parameters, you can see there's an error now because that default constructor doesn't exist anymore. And as a user, I mean, I could make a mistake, or I could do something where I would just leave this empty, where I don't enter any parameters. So by convention, and this isn't a rule or anything, it's always good to make another constructors where you set everything to the default value. So in this case, let's just copy this over here, and I will just remove all my parameters, and let's just set all the values to their default values. This is kind of like that default constructor that Java made for you, and it's just serving the same purpose as well. So yeah, constructor overloading, it's kind of like method overloading, and it's really useful. I really hope this video showed you a real practical example where you could use something like constructor overloading, and I really hope it was a quick review for method overloading and constructors as well. Thank you and have a great day.